In July 1944, while armies were still fighting across two oceans, 44 nations quietly met in a small hotel in New Hampshire to decide something almost as consequential as the war itself. Whose money would run the post-war world? To understand why that meeting mattered, we have to look back to the chaos of the 1930s. During the Great Depression, country after country devalued its currency, trying to make its exports cheaper than its neighbors. These beggar-thy-neighbor policies triggered a vicious cycle: retaliation, trade barriers, and a collapse in global commerce. Many economists and historians believe this currency chaos deepened the Depression and helped set the stage for World War II itself. As the war raged in 1941, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met at sea and issued the Atlantic Charter. Among its principles, a commitment to economic collaboration between all nations once the war ended. Planning for a new financial order began years before the war was even won. Two men in particular would shape the debate: Harry Dexter White, a U.S. Treasury economist, and John Maynard Keynes, the legendary British economist. White wanted a system that would prevent destabilizing swings in capital, anchored firmly around the U.S. dollar. Keynes, representing a Britain deeply in debt from the war, wanted a system with more flexibility to help rebuild devastated economies. For nearly 3 years, the two men negotiated and clashed over what the post-war financial system should look like. By mid-1944, with Allied victory in Europe looking more certain by the week, it was time to bring the world's finance ministers together. The United States chose an unlikely venue: a grand, secluded hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. In July 1944, the world's economic future would be decided far from any battlefield, at a resort called Bretton Woods. On July 1st, 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations began arriving at the Mount Washington Hotel. In total, 730 delegates, translators, and staff descended on the remote resort. The location was chosen deliberately: secluded enough to avoid distraction, and secure enough to manage wartime security. For 3 intense weeks, committees worked around the clock, debating the technical architecture of a new global economy. John Maynard Keynes led the commission responsible for designing what would become the World Bank. Behind closed doors, the negotiations were often tense. Nations with vastly different economic interests had to find common ground. Because the United States controlled roughly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, its delegation carried outsized influence. The final plan largely resembled the American proposal, with concessions made to ease British concerns. Smaller and war-ravaged nations, meanwhile, had comparatively little leverage in the room. Soviet delegates also attended and actively participated in the negotiations. Yet after the conference, Stalin would ultimately refuse to ratify the agreement, dismissing the new institutions as tools of American finance. As the conference neared its planned end date, negotiators still hadn't reached full agreement, so they extended the talks by 3 additional days. Finally, on July 22, 1944, delegates signed the final act of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Keynes, addressing the closing session, called it an attempt to find a common measure, a common standard, a common rule acceptable to each and not irksome to any. What emerged from those 3 weeks would define the global economy for the next 3 decades, and shape it in some ways to this very day. The Bretton Woods agreements created 2 entirely new institutions. The International Monetary Fund was designed to monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to countries facing financial trouble. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what we now know as the World Bank, was created to help finance the rebuilding of war-torn economies. But the most consequential decision concerned the currency system underpinning it all. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other member currency, in turn, would be pegged to the US dollar. In effect, the dollar became as good as gold, and every other currency became, indirectly, as good as the dollar. This arrangement gave the United States something no other nation had: the ability to print the world's primary reserve currency. For a war-ravaged world desperate for stability, Tying everything to the dollar seemed like the safest possible anchor. The system formally came into force in December 1945, once enough member governments had ratified it. By 1958, full convertibility was in place. The Bretton Woods system was now fully operational, and the US dollar sat at the very center of the global economy. We'll be right back to see how this system reshaped the post-war world and the growing pressure that would eventually break it. Through the 1950s and 60s, the Bretton Woods system underpinned an extraordinary period of global economic growth. European and Japanese economies, rebuilt in part with American assistance through the Marshall Plan, boomed under the stability the dollar provided. But the system contained a fundamental, built-in contradiction. For the world to have enough dollars to trade and hold in reserve, the United States had to run persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it received. Yet the more dollars circulated overseas, the harder it became for the U.S. to credibly promise that every single one could be redeemed for gold. Economists call this contradiction the Triffin dilemma, after the economist who first identified it. By the 1960s, foreign governments and central banks were holding far more dollars than the United States had gold to back them. The U.S. financed an expensive war in Vietnam and ambitious domestic programs, printing more dollars along the way. Foreign confidence in the dollar's gold backing began to visibly erode. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, grew openly skeptical and at one point sent a ship to New York specifically to convert French dollar holdings into physical gold. Other nations quietly began doing the same, and the pressure on America's gold reserves intensified. By the late 1960s, it had become mathematically impossible for the United States to honor its gold promise if all dollar holders demanded redemption at once. Something in the system had to give. The question wasn't if the Bretton Woods system would break, it was when and how. That moment arrived in the summer of 1971. Coming up, the single weekend that changed global finance forever, and the surprising way American dollar dominance survived anyway. On August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon gathered his top economic advisors in secret at Camp David. For 2 days, they hammered out a dramatic new economic plan. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation on television. Among his announcements, the United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. He described the move as temporary. In reality, the gold window would never reopen. The announcement, made without consulting America's allies, stunned governments around the world. It became known as the Nixon Shock, and it effectively ended the Bretton Woods system just 27 years after it began. In December 1971, major economies attempted a fix called the Smithsonian Agreement, adjusting the dollar's value against gold. That arrangement lasted barely 14 months before collapsing entirely. By February 1973, the world's major currencies were floating freely against one another, with no fixed anchor to gold at all. For the first time since Bretton Woods, the dollar's value would be set not by a fixed formula, but by global markets. Many assumed America's outsized financial influence would fade along with the gold standard. Instead, U.S. officials worked quickly to build a new foundation for dollar dominance, this time based on oil rather than gold. In 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon traveled to Saudi Arabia to negotiate a landmark arrangement. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports in U.S. dollars and invest its oil revenues back into American assets in exchange for military support and protection. Other major oil producers gradually followed Saudi Arabia's lead. This arrangement became known as the Petrodollar system, and it gave the dollar a powerful new anchor, even without gold behind it. As long as oil, the world's most essential commodity, was priced in dollars, nations around the world still needed to hold large dollar reserves. The gold standard was gone, but American financial dominance not only survived, it deepened. The institutions born at Bretton Woods, meanwhile, never disappeared either. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank remain headquartered in Washington, D.C., still central players in the global economy today. Today, the U.S. dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, used in the vast majority of global trade and financial transactions. But that dominance is no longer unquestioned. In recent years, countries like Russia, China, and Iran have pushed de-dollarization efforts, seeking to reduce their dependence on the dollar-based system. Groups like the BRICS nations have openly discussed alternative trade currencies and payment systems. Whether these efforts meaningfully challenge dollar dominance or simply chip at its edges remains one of the biggest open questions in global economics today. What's certain is that the foundation for all of it, for better or worse, was poured over 3 weeks in the summer of 1944. A conference most people have never heard of, in a hotel most people couldn't find on a map, quietly built the financial architecture the entire world still operates within. Wars are remembered through battles and generals, but some of the 20th century's most consequential victories were won in conference rooms, over exchange rates and gold reserves. 80 years later, the money in your pocket, wherever you are in the world, still carries an echo of that hotel in the New Hampshire mountains. That wraps up our first 4 episodes of WWII, Forgotten Nations. Which forgotten story should we tell next? Subscribe to Gold Era History and let us know in the comments. Remember, history always has many different angles, and this is just one way to tell it. You can find our reference sources in the description below.